Avichai Zur, who is giving a speech about Gradowski's diary, a literary theological analysis. Avichai Zur is waiting for an official approval for his PhD in Jewish philosophy and mysticism at the University of Potsdam. His field of interest and research is the meaning of the existence of evil in the world, sin and suffering in Jewish thought, and in particular in Kabbalah and Hasidism. The main zone of evil Avichai examines is the torment zone of the Holocaust. He tries to deal with this answerless zone by creating new and paradoxical concepts which emerge in the interfacing point between Kabbalah and Hasidut on the one hand, and critical theory and general philosophy on the other hand. Avichai is the grandson of Chaim Tzvi Bornemann, the founder and first publisher of some of the parts of Zalmen Gradowski's writings.
Thank you. The paradox of faith and heresy in Zalman Gradowski's diary. Zalman Gradowski's diary from Auschwitz could be characterized by its excessive use of lyrical means and pathos-filled descriptions. This excessive lyrical and pathos can be found, for instance, in his emotional descriptions of typological figures, the mother, the daughter, the beloved one, etc., or in his sentimental appeal of lamentation and defiance to the moon. Thus, for example, he writes in the section A Moonlight Night, "I loved her, trembling I used to wait for her. For long hours I stood like a faithful slave, admiring her magnificence and magic. As is fascinated, hypnotized, my eyes used to look at her kingdom, at the deep blue night sky, adorned with sparkling polished stars like diamonds, and waited in solemn tension for the royal moment of her arrival." Reading his writing raises the question of why a person who is situated in the heart of hell and endanger himself by writing does not dedicate his little writing material to a factual account of the life of the Sonderkommando. This question is reinforced by Gradowski's own awareness of the historical significance of his writing, about which he notifies historians as he writes in several languages in his introduction to the section of the diary which describes the journey to Auschwitz. Take an interest in this document which contains rich material to the historian. A possible solution to the question may arise from a literary theological analysis of the diary. This analysis, which I would like to introduce now, does not impose its a priori and objective concepts on its object of analysis, the witness or his text, in order not to lose its unique voice, or to be more precise, not to lose its effort to overcome its voicelessness, which is caused by the wordless traumatic situation in which it is found, and its structured lack. On the other hand, this analysis does not subjectively over-identify with its object of analysis and does not succumb to its radical and traumatic dissolution without the ability to derive meaning from it. In contrast to these two positions, this analysis is carried out by what Dominique Lacapa calls an empathic unsettlement, in which the scholar's concepts are challenged and grow from within the voice of the witness or text itself. A similar notion can be found in Rabbi Nachman's of Breslau Theosophy. He was a Hasidic Rebbe. For him, the phrase of the Mishnah, "judge everyone favorably," does not mean to do the sentenced person a favor and forego his objective trial or punishment, in order to subjectively identify with him and give him a chance to rectify. On the contrary, it is judging and punishing him, but favorably, that is to say, for his own good and from his point of view, so the punishment itself will rectify him. Primo Levi, who was mentioned before, Primo Levi argued that if we truly want to understand what happened in the camps, we must give up the dichotomous judgment which strives to separate black and white and enter what he calls the gray zone. This does not mean we may not judge, since avoiding any kind of judgment holds the danger of lacking the moral and political lessons learned from the Holocaust. Even Gradowski himself asked his readers, asked in his last letter, that the future will judge according to my writing about us. The gray zone takes a different, paradoxical point of judgment, which in many respects is analogous to the paradoxical religious position that appears in the writings of Kabbalah and Hasidism, especially in relation to radical situations such as Gradowski's. In this radical state, faith and heresy serves as one. On the one hand, Gradowski's appeal to the moon can be interpreted as an indirect appeal to God, for the moon is a symbol of the lower divine revelation, that of the Kabbalistic Sephirah of Malchut, which dwells within this world and leads the nation of Israel. Gradowski turns to the moon defiantly. Why do you appear here where the air is full of death and destruction, and where to the high heavens the cries and heart-rending screams of women and children, fathers and mothers, being deported to bestial death without guilt are floating? Here you should not have shone. Here, on the worst corner of the earth, where people are tortured in wild brutality and are consistently drowning in the sea of the woes and the blood, and are waiting in fear for the inevitable death, here you should not have shone anymore. Some heretics declare, for instance, that God was buried in Auschwitz. As a matter of fact, in this declaration, they see heresy as a solution to their condition. They claim that their previous faith was in fact a mistake, and actually there is no one to defy, and now they can find another moral meaning for their existence and suffering. Unlike this heresy, Gradowski's heresy is quite different. He does not a priori deny the existence of God, and his heresy is not a practical act, but, like in Rabbi Nachman's theosophy, his heresy is an existential state in which he seeks divine providence that would give meaning to his existence and suffering. Unfortunately, however, he does not find it. In this, suffering is added to his pain. Not only is he physically hurt, but this pain has no spiritual significance and justification. In such a situation, Gradowski's words are a defiance of God, a defiance that receives its strength precisely because Gradowski preserves, rather than revokes, the discourse of faith, and precisely from within it defies God. Moreover, the indirect appeal to God through the moon, or the Malchut Sephirah, preserves the discourse of faith and the indirect path to God, but at the same time, this indirect appeal intensifies the defiance itself, since it constitutes a violation of the halacha, the religious Jewish law, which forbids appealing to any middle entity standing between man and God. On the other hand, heresy itself also serves and strengthens faith. The Luriani Kabbalah describes how the divine infinity contracted itself in order to allow the existence of a finite world with its limits, laws, and human free choice, a world which was creating in the vacant space left after the divine contraction. Nonetheless, the same mystical point of view stresses that without divine presence, that finite world could not exist, or at least would lack divine providence and hence would be meaningless. Ha'ari disciples controverted over the question whether the divine contraction should be interpreted literally or as nothing more than a human illusion. But others, such as Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, claimed a paradoxical claim. God's departure left a reshimu, a Kabbalistic concept which means an impression, not a residue, but rather a present which stems from the absence itself. This absent presence could be demonstrated, for instance, in a case of a man who in his anger had left the room and slammed the door. Although he physically is not present in the room, his anger is. Moreover, this anger is actually more present than if the angry man was physically present in the room expressing his anger directly. Thus, argues Rabbi Nachman, agony and meaninglessness themselves, which are the necessary outcome of the divine absence, are the factors that enable the existence of the finite world and of free human choice. God is present in them precisely because he is absent, and it is precisely through them that creative and free human Torah novelis emerges. But notice, it is not that God is present specifically and directly in agony and absurdity as such, as claim certain Christian theologians who emphasized human passivity and active divine grace. On the contrary, for Rabbi Nachman, God is specifically present in the good, while in agony he is indeed absent, but this absence indirectly points out the presence of God and turns him passive, so to speak, thereby allowing the human activity of free creativity. This point also arises in Gradowski's diary. Gradowski tries to arouse his readers' feelings by the means mentioned earlier, but the result achieved is quite the opposite. Instead of empathy, the reader feels alienated from the Sakharinic sentimentality and from the anonymous typological figures, which tell him very little about the actual reality of the Sonderkommando's life and prevent him from meeting Gradowski himself. Paradoxically, this failure also succeeds in fulfilling his other wish. The readers, emotionally alienated and distant from Gradowski and his typological figures, are actually put by these descriptions in Gradowski's shoes, understanding his own situation and point of view. This is so because Gradowski himself claims that he is numb, that he cannot cry over his beloved ones because he is drowning in a sea of blood, and maybe also because of the excess of female nudity he was exposed to, and which he describes in details, till his eyes and senses were dazzled and blinded. And so he asked the reader to shed tears for his relatives in his place. Oh me, the son, cannot even now, here in my hell, cry at all, because I drown every day in a sea of blood. One wave pursues the other. There is not a moment when you can invade a corner of your own and sit down to cry. The permanent and systematic death is deafens, confuses, blurs your senses. You cannot feel even the greatest suffering. The private destruction is swallowed up by the general one. And sometimes the heart is cut, the soul is plucked. Why am I sitting so calmly and not lamenting, not crying about my tragedy, but frozen, dull, then degenerated are all emotions? At times I hoped, sometimes comforted, that a time would come when I would be lucky to be able to cry, but who knows? I want now, and this is my only wish, that if I cannot mourn for them, that a strange eye would let a tear fall on my beloved ones. In this sense, Gradowski's excessive lyrical and pathos-filled descriptions lead his readers as well to numbness and alienation, just as the excess of death and nudity has led him to numbness himself. This insight could also explain the fact that, except for the prefaces of some of the sections of the diary, and except for his appeal to the moon in the second section, in almost all the description of the life of the Sonderkommando, Gradowski refrained from a personal account using the singular first person, but specifically uses the third person, creating an even larger defamiliarization when he uses general personal typological descriptions. However, this changes in the section of the separation. This section deals with a selection that occurred within the Sonderkommando, with the disappointment that they did not rebel despite their initial pretension, and with the reasons why they refrained from doing so. At the end of this section, Gradowski describes, again in third person, a man who is situated in the tension between two opposite groups. On the one hand, the believers who with zealous devotion continue to pray to God 3 times a day, and on the other hand, the embitterers who refuse to pray to a Father God who abandoned his children to suffer alone and die in the death camp. That person sees the property left behind by those who were taken in the selection and recalls their Shabbat service. The memory of the prayers carries him to the memories of the Shabbat in his parents' home, and at the same time the description transforms from the third person to the first person. This transformation reveals that the indecisive man is no other than Gradowski himself, who in principle belongs to the heresy of the embitterers, but adheres to the prayers and to the prayer and faith of the pious. Gradowski describes how from the sea of memories of the Shabbat, which parallel to the sea of blood that had dulled Gradowski's feeling, he finally reaches the shore of faith and joy. Ostensibly, these memories, faith and joy are positive and optimistic, being detached from the negative and pessimistic reality, as Gradowski writes. Then I used to run there, where a few Jewish quorums stand in holy devotion and pray. There I used to dredge up the light, to take a spark with which I used to run away to my cell, and with its warmth I used to melt my heart's frost. Then I had a happy Shabbat night. But right after that, Gradowski explains the substance of this happiness, revealing its paradoxical essence, which does not detach from reality at all. I was lifted up through the stormy waves of my vanished years, and when I reached the shore, to my Shabbat of today, my heart died in tears. I was happy. I had tearful Shabbat. For long I longed for her, that I would see in my imagination my heartily beloved mother, that I would see my good father, and then weep for my most beloved and my most precious, who vanished forever. To mourn for my Shabbats, which would never return, to mourn my disaster, which now I felt and sensed for the first time. The faith reached by Gradowski does not escape from the terrible reality which lacks God's providence and meaning. On the contrary, it is faith that grows from within the heresy itself, which reveals God precisely because he is indeed absent. His happiness is nothing but happiness about the fact that his emotions have returned to him, about the very capability to weep and mourn for his terrible, meaningless and godless state, and for his lost relatives. Thus, it is precisely faith and the preservation of the faith discourse with God that allows for a sharp and defiant criticism of him. Criticism that expresses the heresy state in which the suffering person is unfortunately found. But even in this state of actual heresy, which no longer finds God and his providence and meaning in the world, and even in a state of actual and radical dissolution, in which we can no more speak about the victory of the Spirit, or about permanent spiritual image of God which always exists inside a human being and which nothing could ever eliminate. Even in this situation, and precisely from within them, emerges and rises the paradoxical faith, the faith of Reshimu, impression, which is far more profound and creative than the ordinary and straightforward faith.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for some short questions.
Mine may not be so short, but I wanted just to make the link with what was just said in Tom Lawson's paper also. I think it's very interesting because the first question you're asking, why didn't Gradowski write in a more factual or detailed manner about the life of the Sonderkommando? And Tom was saying, yes, the Sonderkommando are inviting themselves that we have this other reading of their testimony, and it is interesting and important for the historian to look into this inner life as they are describing it, and not only the facts and the details about how the murder and the mass murder was perpetrated, but also why they made their choices. And it's also what Löwenthal always says. It's important. It's an important material for the future historian to know how we were living this experience. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I already knew your interpretation of it, and I read it before, and it was very interesting for me because it confirmed, so to speak, something I was just I had an instinct about, your interpretation of this relationship to the moon, and we were also speaking about it with Noach earlier this day, and he was saying it is only a very pathos-filled, romantic way of addressing the moon, and I was saying no, I really think there is this very deep theological interpretation that must be addressed, and I was really very interested in your approach, and you are talking about this paradoxical phase that arises from this relationship, And what just struck me again, hearing you, is you are speaking, and I can't follow you in this step, when you are saying, we become numbed, as Gradowski was numbed by his pathos-filled images and metaphors, and and he doesn't speak for himself. He never uses the I, or rarely, and he speaks always in the name of the collective. And I was wondering, but why do you stop your reading as a continuity of already traditional and culturally heritated forms of Jewish liturgy or Jewish literature? Why do you stop them here? Why do you stop this interpretation just at this point? Because this use of the we and the speaking in the name of a collective is also a very important form. And it's culturally, it's a cultural tradition that is also inherited. So why do you see there precisely this numbness, or how do you say that in English? Numb, yes.
When I translated the diary, I felt no, this is the only answer.
It's just, it's subjective.
Generally, I don't like poetry. It's my you know.
It's not poetry.
It's not the poetry. It's a bad thing. It's my. You
don't like what?
Poetry. I don't like poetry. It's
poetry.
I don't like it. I don't know why. But I don't like it. I don't understand it. And when someone explains it to me, I'll say, "Oh, this is very nice what you're saying. Why did you say it like that?" But it's me. It's not the poetry. So when I read it, I asked myself, why did he do it? And then I used the theological, the traditional notions to inquire to find an answer. And to understand why he is saying it's very important for the historian. I'm not an historian, but he's saying it's for the historian, it's very important, and why doesn't he give the facts for the historian? So when I met the question, then I used the traditional and Jewish notions to context.
Just this is the point. Why? Sorry. This is for me the point to listen. Why you want to compare this testimony to the theology with of the tradition? You quote Rabbi Nachman. Yes.
Why?
Why?
Okay, first of all...
No, because I understood your topic, of course, but why in this theological perspective of Gradowski to related to Kant of the root of the tradition, because he was in fact informed about, I don't remember, I read the text of Gradowski a long time ago, or because your interpretation?
The both answers are right. First of all, Gradowski was a religious man, and I don't think he read Rabbi Nachman of Breslau, but I think he knew Kabbalah. He knew the moon is a symbol of the Malchut Sephira in Kabbalah. I think he knew that. I'm not an historian. I cannot prove it. But I have the feeling nobody can. But when I read it, I feel it. And the second answer is also right, because like you use Primo Levi or Jean-François Lyotard, I use Rabbi Nachman of Breslau. It's not just something of. It's not for me. Rabbi Nachman is not just a person who influenced or did not influence Gradowski. For me, he has concepts, and I use them to inquire and analyze texts. And
there are many references in the text, theological references in the text. Hebraism refers to the books.
Thank you for the presentation. I didn't understood. What have you translated? What have you personally translated?
I translated Gradowski's diary from Yiddish to Hebrew.
From Yiddish to Hebrew?
Yeah.
Okay. And why do you think that to appeal to the moon is there such a strong feature of feeling of these theological points which you have discussed about? Okay, Gradowski was from the religious families, we know it. Langfuss himself is some kind of the religious authority in this Zentrum of Sonderkommando. So, and some other authors of the text were less religious. We know their origin, sociological, and so on. So why do we think? What forces you to think that any being, by the way, not a fan of poetry, why forces you to think that it is just something Hasidic, something just Jewish theological, and not something maybe poetical? Please explain it.
Okay, of course it's poetical. Of course it's poetical. Nothing is forcing me, except for the numbness I felt when I translated, and I tried to not to say it. Just why did he write like that? I don't want to read it. I want to read it. I want to understand it. And I have my tools. Poetry tools are very good, and I wish someone will analyze the diary with poetry tools. But I cannot do it. My discipline is theology, theosophy, and mysticism. And when I read the moon, and when someone religious talking about the moon, there is a reference for that. Nothing is forcing it, and I'm not sure he did it consciously, and maybe he didn't know he's doing it, but I'm saying he's doing it. This is an interpretation. It's not a factual proof or something like that.
And have you made an attempt to check this methodology, let us call it so, on other Sonderkommando members' texts, for example, Langfuss?
No, not yet.
Can we have a last question?
Who would be interested in the moon? Not interesting.
Sag mal auf Deutsch.
Who would be interested in a moon?
Everybody.
Who doesn't be interested? It makes sense only if it is theological, I think.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, so I think we open up some discussion here. I'm really sorry, already kind of late.